Hello and welcome to Classic Canadian Sasquatch Stories, Episode 1. This video is a compilation of 3 smaller videos I've previously published on my channel, on classic Sasquatch stories from the Agassiz-Harrison Valley. Located in southwestern British Columbia, about an hour and a half east of Vancouver, is a magical enclave in the Lillooet Range of the Coast Mountains, which surrounds the vast Harrison Lake and the very short Harrison River. The Harrison being a tributary of the Fraser River, which empties into the latter just north of the city of Chilliwack. Each of these videos was generously narrated by my friend Bryan, who runs an excellent and entertaining podcast called Unexplained Reality. Bryan's podcast treats with true stories of the weird, the strange, and the unexplained, all subjects which I personally find fascinating. I've included links to Bryan's website and podcast in the description. The latter 2 videos feature footage courtesy of my friend Jason, who runs a fantastic YouTube channel called Natural Gallant Bodybuilding. In his videos, Jason shares knowledge pertaining to nutrition and weightlifting, which he acquired throughout his 27-year career as a competitive natural bodybuilder. I've included links to Jason's website and YouTube channel in the description. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
In British Columbia and the northwestern United States, the Sasquatch hardly needs an introduction. This elusive, wild, hairy giant, once an obscure character of First Nations lore, now serves as an icon of the Pacific Northwest. 8 years ago, it inspired Quachi, a monstrous mascot for the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, British Columbia. For 12 years, it has been featured in Messin' with Sasquatch, a series of hilarious Jack Link's beef jerky commercials in which it is portrayed as the vengeful enemy of outdoorsy pranksters. And for 16 years, it has shared its name with a famous Memorial Day music festival in George Washington, USA. Another institution to which the Sasquatch lent its name is the Sasquatch Mountain Resort, a ski hill tucked away in the Douglas Mountains, an hour's drive north of Chilliwack, British Columbia. The resort is aptly named as most of its runs wind down the northeastern slope of Mount Keenan, a formation once known as Mount Morris, and the birthplace of the word Sasquatch. On the road from Chilliwack to the Sasquatch Mountain Resort, in the vicinity of the bridge over the Harrison River, lies the Chehalis Indian Reserve, home of the Chehalis First Nation. The Chehalis people, not to be confused with their cousins from Puget Sound, with whom they share a name, are a Coast Salish people whose traditional territory revolves around the mouth of the Harrison River, a tributary of the Fraser. Back in 1925, an Irish expat named John Walter Burns became both the Indian agent and the school teacher at the Chehalis Reserve. Burns quickly earned the respect of the local natives and became fast friends with Frank Dan, a prominent Chehalis medicine man. In those days, the Chehalis people were typically reluctant to share their stories with white men for fear of ridicule. Since J.W. Burns had demonstrated an open-mindedness towards their myths and legends, however, they eventually opened up to him and made him privy to some of their most carefully guarded secrets. Among the most intriguing of these were tales of wild, hairy giants who, the Chehalis maintained, had inhabited the forest surrounding the reserve since time immemorial. In 1929, Burns compiled some of these stories and published them in an article in the April 1, 1929 issue of the Canadian magazine Maclean's, under the headline, Introducing BC's Hairy Giants, a collection of strange tales about British Columbia's wildmen as told by those who say they have seen them. The tales of hairy wildmen recounted in J.W. Burns' 1929 article in Maclean's magazine are some of the most colorful of their kind to date. The first of these anecdotes details the experience of a Chehalis Indian man named Peter Williams in May 1909. While walking in the woods along the foot of Mount Morris about a mile from the reserve, Williams heard a grunt in the bush. When he looked to see where the sound had come from, he found himself staring at what he first took to be a bear crouched atop a boulder about 30 feet away. As he raised his rifle to shoot the animal, it stood up and emitted a piercing scream. "It was a man," said Williams, "a giant no less than 6 1/2 feet in height and covered in hair. Enraged, the giant leapt from the boulder and tore after the Indian." "I never ran so fast before or since," said Williams, "through brush and undergrowth towards the Chehalis River, a tributary of the Harrison, where my dugout was moored." Every so often Williams glanced over his shoulder to check on his pursuer, who was quickly overtaking him. Williams narrowly escaped the monster by leaping into his boat and paddling downriver as fast as he could. The swift river, he said, did not in the least daunt the giant, for he began to wade it immediately. When he finally reached the safety of his cabin, Williams made sure that his wife and children were safe inside before bolting the door and barricading the entrance. Then, with my rifle ready, Williams said, I stood near the door and awaited his coming. After about 20 minutes, Williams heard a noise in the distance, somewhat akin to the trampling of a horse. The noise became louder and louder. Williams eventually looked through a crack between the logs of the cabin wall and saw that the giant was approaching. Darkness had not yet set in, he said, and I had a good look at him, except that he was covered with hair and twice the bulk of the average man. There was nothing to distinguish him from the rest of us. When the monster reached the cabin, he began pushing the walls so that the structure rocked back and forth. The cabin creaked and groaned, yet by some miracle it managed to maintain its integrity. Clutching his rifle with trembling hands, Williams whispered for his wife to take the children and hide under the bed. After prowling and grunting like an animal around the house, Williams continued, he went away. The family spent a restless night in the cabin, and in the morning Williams found the beast tracks in the mud outside, which were 22 inches long, but narrow in proportion to their length. The giant so damaged their cabin that Williams' family was forced to abandon it the following winter. Sometime later that season, Peter Williams went duck hunting on the north side of the Harrison River, about 2 miles from the reserve. Once again, he found himself face to face with the same hairy giant he had encountered the previous summer. As before, Williams ran for dear life, and the wild man chased after him. After about 400 yards, the giant broke off and wandered back into the woods. Interestingly, Peter's brother Paul encountered the same creature later that afternoon. While he was fishing for salmon in a creek near the reserve, the giant emerged from the forest and began to approach him. Terrified, Paul raced back towards his cabin with the monster hot on his heels. The giant gave up the chase shortly before Paul reached the cabin and walked back into the bush. Exhausted from fear and exertion, Paul collapsed in the snow and had to be carried inside by his mother and other relatives. The first and second time, Williams told J.W. Burns, I was all alone when I met this strange mountain creature. Then, early in the spring of the following year, another man and myself were bear hunting near the place where I found him. On this occasion, we ran into 2 of these giants. Initially, Williams and his companions thought the creatures were tree stumps. Suddenly, when they were about 50 feet away, the wildmen who had been sitting on the ground rose to their feet. Burns and his companions stopped dead in their tracks. We were close enough to know they were man and woman, Williams said. The woman was the smaller of the 2, but neither of them as big or fierce-looking as the gent that chased me. Williams and his friend ran home and were not pursued. One morning, several weeks later, Williams and his wife were fishing in a canoe on the Harrison River, not far from the reserve. Upon paddling around a bend, they saw the same hairy giant that had destroyed their cabin the previous year. Fortunately, the monster took no notice of the Indians, and they made their escape without incident. Another wildman encounter Burns included in the article was the story of an elderly Indian named Charlie Victor. Unlike Williams, Charlie Victor was not a member of the Chehalis First Nation, but rather hailed from the Squaw Nation, a Coast Salish tribe from the Chilliwack area. The first time I came to know about these people, Victor said, I did not see anybody. On this particular occasion, Victor was foraging with 3 other men on a rocky mountain slope about 6 miles from Yale, a town which lies on the CPR's main line just north of Hope, British Columbia. He and his companions were picking salmon berries, wild fruits similar to raspberries. In our search for berries, Victor said, we suddenly stumbled upon a large opening in the side of the mountain. This discovery greatly surprised all of us, for we knew every foot of the mountain, and we never knew nor heard there was a cave in the vicinity. Near the cave's mouth was a massive boulder, which looked as though it once might have been employed as a primitive door. The natives cautiously approached the cave and peered inside, but were unable to see anything on account of the darkness. In order to combat this, they gathered pitchwood, a type of pine heartwood naturally saturated with flammable resin, lit it on fire, and began to explore. Not far from the mouth of the cave, the natives came upon a primitive stone house. We couldn't make a thorough examination, Victor explained, for our pitchwood kept going out. We left, intending to return in a couple of days and go on exploring. When Victor and his companions told the tale of their discovery to their fellow tribesmen back at the reserve, the elders warned them not to venture near it again, as it was surely occupied by a wild man. That was the first time I heard about the hairy men that inhabit the mountains, Victor told Burns. Disregarding the elders' advice, Victor and his companions went back to explore the cave. When they reached it, they discovered, to their astonishment, that the massive boulder that stood near the entrance had been rolled back over the mouth, fitting so perfectly that you might suppose it had been made for that purpose. About 20 years later, Charlie Victor and a couple of his friends were bathing in a small lake near Yale, British Columbia. After Victor had finished his ablutions and was putting on his clothes, a big hairy man stepped out from behind a rock only several feet away. He looked at me for a moment, Victor said. His eyes were so kind-looking that I was about to speak with him when he turned about and walked into the forest. In around 1914, Charlie Victor had a second encounter with a hairy wild giant while hunting in the mountains near the village of Hatsik, just east of Mission, British Columbia. Mission being a town on the banks of the Fraser River, located a half-hour drive from Chilliwack. On this excursion, Victor was accompanied by his dog. Upon hiking up to a plateau, his dog rushed over to a large cedar tree and began to growl and bark at it. Victor noticed that there was a large hole in the tree about 7 feet from the ground, and that his dog apparently wanted to enter it. Victor lifted his dog up and watched it scurry into the hole. Suddenly, a muffled cry issued from within the tree. Victor raised his rifle, thinking that his dog had encountered a bear. Sure enough, something large crawled out of the hole and fell to the ground. Instinctively, Victor took a shot at it, an action which he immediately regretted, for there at his feet sprawled a bleeding, naked, black-haired Caucasian boy of about 13 years of age. Horrified, Victor dropped his rifle and approached the boy to examine the extent of his injury. He saw that he had shot the boy in the leg, but before he had a chance to dress the wound, the boy cried out as if appealing for help from the forest. From across the mountain, a long way off, Victor said, rolled a booming voice. Shortly thereafter, Victor heard the voice again, this time a little closer. The boy screamed again, as if in reply. Terrified though he was, Victor's conscience would not allow him to abandon the boy he had wounded. He waited on the plateau, his dog whimpering fearfully at his feet, while the boy guided his mysterious sylvan savior to his location. Less than a half hour later, said Victor, out of the depth of the forest came the strangest and wildest creature one could possibly see. The hairy creature, he continued, for that was what it was, walked toward me without the slightest fear. The wild person was a woman. Her face was almost negro black, and her long straight hair fell to her waist. In height, she would be about 6 feet, but her chest and shoulders were well above the average in breadth. Victor told Burns that although he had already met several wild men by this time, he had never seen anyone quite so savage in appearance as this woman. I'm sure that if that wild woman laid hands on me, Victor said, she'd break every bone in my body. The creature glanced at the boy before rounding on Victor, her face contorted with rage. Then something truly remarkable happened. Using the tongue of the Douglas First Nation, a branch of the Lillooet tribe, whose members lived at the northern end of Harrison Lake, the wild woman snarled, "You have shot my friend." Victor, who knew the Douglas language, replied that he had mistaken the boy for a bear, and that he was sorry. Ignoring him, the wild woman proceeded to dance around the boy, chanting the word Yahoo in a loud voice. Every time she vociferated, a similar reply came from the mountain. Soon, the wild woman was joined by another creature like her, who carried a 6-foot-long cord which Victor suspected was either a snake or the intestine of some animal, but whatever it was, he said, she constantly struck the ground with it. At the end of this strange ceremony, the second wild woman effortlessly picked up the boy with one hairy hand. That accomplished, she turned towards Charlie Victor, pointed the cord at him, and said, "Siwash, you'll never kill another bear." With that, the wild woman and the boy disappeared into the woods. With tears in his eyes, Charlie Victor admitted to J.W. Burns that indeed he had not shot a bear nor any other animal since that fateful day. Another wild man story which J.W. Burns included in his article derives from a letter which Burns received from a young native man from Vancouver named William Point. According to the letter, Point and a native girl named Adeline August decided to pick wild hops one day in late September 1927 in the wilderness near Agassiz, British Columbia, a town located about 8 kilometers south of Harrison Hot Springs, just north of the Fraser River. When they were finished, they returned to August's father's orchard by the way of the railroad track. Along the way, August noticed something walking along the tracks in their direction. "I looked up," wrote Point, "but paid no attention to it, as I thought it was some person on his way to Agassiz. But as he came closer, we noticed that his appearance was very odd, and on coming still closer, he stood still and were astonished, seeing that the creature was naked and covered with hair like an animal. Nearly scared stiff, Point picked up 2 stones with which he intended to hit the creature if it decided to attack him or August. He was twice as big as the average man, Point wrote of the creature, with hands so long that they almost touched the ground. It seemed to me that his eyes were very large, and the lower part of his nose was wide and spread over the greater part of his face." Terrified at the creature's appearance, the teenagers ran all the way to Agassiz. There they told the story of their encounter to a group of natives who were enjoying themselves after a day of berry picking. The elders there informed them that the creature belonged to a race of hairy giants who had always lived in the mountains, making their homes in tunnels and caves. There are 2 factors which make J.W. Burns' 1929 article in Maclean's magazine especially remarkable. The first is that, in Charlie Victor's tale of the Wild Woman of Hatzig, the wild woman around whom the story revolves demonstrated the ability to speak, incidentally in the dialect of the Douglas First Nation. To the best of this author's knowledge, this is the first of only 2 stories in which a North American wild man is purported to speak using human language. The second factor which makes Burns's 1929 article truly remarkable is that it is widely believed to be the first instance in which the word Sasquatch appears in print. Although there are older articles which reference the wild men of the Pacific Northwest, Burns's is supposedly the first to actually refer to these creatures as Sasquatch, the name we know them by today. Most sources which purport to explain the etymology of Sasquatch claim that the word is Burns's Anglophonic perversion of the word Sasquatch, a Hochelamalem word meaning hairy mountain man. Hochelamalem being a Coast Salish language spoken by the Chehalis, the Squaw, and other indigenous groups from the Fraser Delta. One researcher named G.N.J. Quasar put forth an interesting alternative theory regarding the origin of the word Sasquatch in his book Recasting Bigfoot. Quasar claimed that the word Sasquatch was really a combination of 2 words, Saskahua and Kinkoch. Saskahua, Quasar claimed, was the British Columbian district for which J.W. Burns became an Indian agent, and Kinkoch, Quasar correctly pointed out, is a Chinook jargon term meaning English, which derived from the words King George. Chinook jargon being an old pidgin trade language endemic to the Pacific Northwest. According to Quasar, the Coast Salish Indians from the Fraser Delta area referred to hairy wild men as Saskahua Kinkoch, literally Englishmen from Saskahua. J.W. Burns, Quasar claims, contracted this phrase into a simpler word, Sasquatch. There's one major potential problem with Quasar's theory. To the best of this author's knowledge, there was never a Saskahua district in British Columbia. A closer look at J.W. Burns' 1929 article reveals that the truth behind the origin of the word Sasquatch may have evaded both G.N. Quasar and mainstream etymologists. In his article, Burns quotes Squaw Indian Charlie Victor as saying of BC's hairy giants, "The strange people, of whom there are but a few now, rarely seen and seldom met, are known by the name of Sasquatch, or the hairy mountain men." Even more importantly, Burns later quotes directly from a letter written by William Point, the young native man from Vancouver who saw a wild man on the railroad tracks near Agassiz. An excerpt from this letter reads, "Old Indians who were present said the wild man was no doubt a Sasquatch, a tribe of hairy people whom they claim have always lived in the mountains, in tunnels and caves." Assuming that Burns faithfully recorded these lines as they were said and written, it appears that the word Sasquatch may actually be an old Hochelamalem word, or at the very least William Point's interpretation of the Chehalis word for BC's hairy wild men, and not some distortion of J.W. Burns. At the beginning of this video, we learned that Mount Keenan, formerly Mount Morris, home of the Sasquatch Mountain Resort, is the birthplace of the word Sasquatch. Indeed, this landmark is the setting for the first story of Burns's article in which Chehalis man Peter Williams had a brush with an angry Sasquatch at the mountain's base. In 1940, Burns wrote another even more dramatic story of a Sasquatch encounter on Mount Keenan, which is perhaps the most extraordinary Sasquatch story ever written. This tale is so remarkable that it deserves a video all to itself. Join us again next week to discover this incredible story behind the naming of the Sasquatch Mountain Resort. In a previous video, we explored the story behind the origin of the word Sasquatch. In this video, we're going to take a look at the disturbing tale behind the naming of the Sasquatch Mountain Resort, a ski hill nestled in the Douglas Mountains north of Chilliwack, British Columbia. For decades, the ski hill on the slopes of Mount Keenan, situated an hour's drive from both Chilliwack and Mission, British Columbia, was known as the Hemlock Resort, ostensibly owing its name to a particular evergreen tree common to the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. In 2018, the resort announced an ambitious expansion plan which it inaugurated with a rebranding campaign. In addition to adopting a new logo, Hemlock changed its name to the Sasquatch Mountain Resort. In a press release, the resort claimed that its new name was an homage to the Chehalis First Nation, on whose traditional territory the ski hill is located. The Sasquatch, which is an anglicized pronunciation of Saskets, is the primary caretaker of the land and an integral aspect of Chehalis identity and spiritual beliefs. Historical experiences with Saskets have been orally documented and passed down from generation to generation. The Sasquatch ensures that the land remains plentiful and well taken care of. Although the Sasquatch Mountain Resort has not indicated an awareness of this in its press releases or on its website, its new name is doubly appropriate for a far more specific reason. Not only is the Sasquatch Mountain Resort located within the traditional territory of the Chehalis First Nation, a tribe closely associated with the legend of the Sasquatch, it is also located on the slopes of Mount Keenan, a landmark formerly known as Mount Morris, home to the most chilling Sasquatch story ever recorded. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, magazine and newspaper articles documented a strange legend espoused by members of the Chehalis First Nation. Chehalis elders whispered that once every 4 years, the Sasquatch, the hairy wild giants of the coastal rainforest, congregated at the peak of Mount Morris, a mountain located just north of the Chehalis Reserve. Natives often encountered traveling Sasquatch in the woods immediately prior to this quadrennial pilgrimage, and some even observed signal fires flickering atop Mount Morris in the dead of the night, perhaps evidence of some mysterious Sasquatch powwow. Throughout the 1930s, a Scottish immigrant named J.W. Burns, who served as both the schoolteacher and the Indian agent at the Chehalis Reserve, wrote a number of articles on the Sasquatch legend, some of them set on or near Mount Morris. In the first of these articles, published in the April 1, 1929 issue of Maclean's magazine, he documented a story told to him by an elderly Chehalis hunter named Charlie Victor. Victor claimed that he had encountered a Sasquatch woman in his youth, and that the creature had spoken to him in the language of the Douglas First Nation, a more northerly Lillooet tribe. Burns published another tale involving a talking Sasquatch, the second of its kind ever recorded, in the January 1940 issue of The Wide World, a magazine for men. This story was told to him by an 87-year-old Chehalis woman named Seraphine Long, who had lived in the area all her life. Her harrowing tale remains one of the most disturbing Sasquatch stories ever told. In 1872, 17-year-old Seraphine Long stumbled from the woods into the Chehalis village near the foot of Mount Morris. The villagers were astonished, as Seraphine had been missing for nearly a year and had long been given up for dead. The girl was in a state of supreme exhaustion and was too weak to talk, and so her inquisitive countrymen withheld their many questions and put her to bed. Later that night, Seraphine gave birth to a monstrous-looking child, which only survived for a few hours. When she was able, Seraphine Long related her incredible experience to her family and friends. Nearly 70 years later, she told the same story to J.W. Burns at the Chehalis Reserve. On the day of her disappearance back in 1871, Seraphine Long had been foraging for cedar roots at the base of Mount Morris, daydreaming about the brave she was engaged to marry. On her way back to camp, A hairy hand shot out of the bush and clamped over her mouth. Seraphine was hoisted into the air and thrown over the shoulder of a hairy giant. I was terrified, the lady told Burns, fought and struggled with all my might. In those days I was strong, but it was no good. The wild man was as powerful as a young bear. Holding me easily under one arm, with his other hand he smeared tree gum over my eyes, sticking them shut so that I could not see where he was taking me. He then lifted me to his shoulder and started to run. The Sasquatch took Seraphine all the way up what could only be Mount Morris. Although I was frightened, Seraphine told Burns, I could not but admire his easy breathing, his great strength, and speed on foot. The Sasquatch brought Seraphine into a large cave near the top of the mountain and removed the tree gum from her eyes. I sat up, Seraphine said, and saw that I was in a great big cave. The floor was covered with animal skins, soft to touch and better preserved than we preserved them. A small fire in the middle of the floor gave all the light there was. As my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, I saw that beside the young giant who had brought me to the cave, there were two other wild people, a man and a woman. To me, a young girl, they seemed very, very old, but they were active and friendly, and later I learned that they were the parents of the young Sasquatch who had stolen me. For nearly a year, the Sasquatches kept Seraphine Long as their prisoner, never allowing her an opportunity to escape. The Sasquatches spoke to each other in a language similar to the tongue of the Douglas Indians, and in time Seraphine learned enough of their speech to communicate with them. They fed me well on roots, fish, and meat, she told Burns. I asked the young giant how he caught and killed the deer, mountain goats, and sheep that he often brought into the cave. He smiled, opening and closing his big hairy hands. I guessed that he just laid in wait, and when an animal got close enough, he leaped, caught it, and choked it to death. He was certainly big enough, quick enough, and strong enough to do so. About a year into her imprisonment, Seraphine Long became very ill. She begged her young Sasquatch captor to return her to her own people so that she could recover. At first he got very angry, she said, as did his father and mother, but I kept on pleading with them, telling them that I wished to see my own people before I died. I really was ill, and I suppose they could see that for themselves, because one day after I cried for a long time, the young Sasquatch went outside and returned with a leaf full of tree gum. With this, he stuck down my eyelids as he had done before. Then he again lifted me to his big shoulder. The return journey was a hazy nightmare for Seraphine Long, who was too weak to even cling to the Sasquatch as he carried her down the mountain. At last he laid her down in the forest not too far from her home and gently removed the sap from her eyelids. When he saw that I could see again, Seraphine said, he shook his head sadly, pointed to my house, and then turned back into the forest. The villagers were wildly excited at Seraphine's return. Too weak to reciprocate their enthusiasm, she crawled into bed. That night, she gave birth to a child which only survived for a few hours. I hope that I never again shall see a Sasquatch, she concluded. If you drive east of Chilliwack, British Columbia, take a left on the BC Highway 9, cross the Fraser River, and continue north for about 10 minutes, you'll enter an enchanting corridor through the coast mountains known as the Agassiz-Harrison Valley. This stretch of farmland, flanked by dark green mountains, covered from base to peak with thick coniferous jungle, leads to a little village hugging the southern shores of the vast Harrison Lake. If you meander through the streets of this tiny community and keep a vigilant eye, you may begin to realize that there's something distinctly different about the place. For instance, you might notice that a hairy sentinel who keeps perpetual watch at the village entrance, lounging contentedly on a wooden bench beneath the town's welcome sign. Perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of another more startling village guardian standing further up the road, poised to hurl a wooden boulder at passing cars. If you're especially observant, you may detect a certain pattern in the titles of various establishments. The names of various inns, liquor stores, and ski resorts hint at a recurring theme. Even the street signs are topped with a stylized silhouette of British Columbia's most elusive resident. Welcome to Harrison Hot Springs, the Sasquatch capital of Canada. Sasquatch is a household name in the Fraser Valley, inducing chuckles in some and primal shivers in others. Derived from an old Central Salish word meaning wild man of the woods, it denotes a legendary race of hairy giants which, according to First Nations tradition and regional folklore, roams the forests of British Columbia to this very day. Although a number of explorers and adventurers recorded variations of it in their little journals and memoirs, the legend of the Sasquatch was first introduced to the general public by a school teacher and later Indian agent named J.W. Burns, who began teaching at the Chehalis First Nation Reserve, located a mere 15 minutes from Harrison Hot Springs, in 1925. Burns used the word Sasquatch for the first time in an article published in the April 1, 1929 issue of Maclean's magazine, and the name stuck. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Burns published a number of accounts of Sasquatch sightings which were reported to him by his Chehalis friends. These sightings took place in the mountainous country surrounding the Chehalis Reserve, from the so-called Mystery Valley west of Harrison Lake to the Sasquatch Cave outside Yale, British Columbia, far to the east. Through what is probably sheer coincidence, the epicenter of the various Sasquatch sightings reported by Burns's informants seemed to be Harrison Hot Springs, a resort community renowned for its thermal mineral waters, which had been used by the Chehalis for centuries and which were discovered by white prospectors during the Fraser River Gold Rush. The village's community fully embraced its newfound status as the Sasquatch capital of Canada and began holding an annual summer festival called Sasquatch Days with the neighboring residents of the Chehalis Reserve, a cherished tradition which endures to this day. Since the publication of Burns's first article, Sasquatch sightings have taken place in the wilderness surrounding Harrison Hot Springs with casual frequency. Perhaps the most famous of these sightings is the one which took place just outside of Ruby Creek, a tiny rural community situated on the banks of the Fraser River about 14 kilometers, 9 miles northeast of Harrison Hot Springs as the crow flies. In 1941, a Chehalis man named George Chapman lived in a cabin near Ruby Creek with his wife Jeannie and their 3 children. One day, while George was away from home, working as a tie gang laborer on the nearby railroad, the eldest of the Chapman children ran into the cabin and declared that a cow had emerged from the woods. Alarmed by the inexplicable panic in her 9-year-old son's tone, Jeannie stepped outside to investigate and spied what she first took to be a grizzly bear ambling along a distant hillside. Her 2 remaining children, aged 7 and 5, were playing in a nearby field at the time and did not appear to be in any imminent danger. Nevertheless, Jeannie decided to call her children to the cabin as a precaution. The bear's strange physical appearance unnerved Jeannie, and so she decided to keep an eye on it from the cabin door as it made its way down the hill towards the railroad. Upon reaching the tracks, the animal, to Jeannie's astonishment, reared up on its hind legs and began to stride towards the cabin like a human. Miss Chapman quickly realized that the creature was not a bear at all, but rather an enormous 8-foot-tall man covered with long brown hair. "I had much too much time to look at it," she would later say of the incident. Jeannie described the giant as having an enormous chest and shoulders, inhumanly long arms, and a small head with dark face. Fearing that the monster was after her children, Miss Chapman unfurled a blanket and used it as a screen to shield her little ones from the wild man's gaze. Ordering her children to stay behind her, she walked backwards from the cabin in the direction of the Fraser River. When they had put considerable distance between themselves and the giant, which had begun to examine the house, Jeannie and her children raced for the safety of Ruby Creek. 2 hours later, George Chapman, none the wiser, returned home from work to find that his home had been ransacked. Specifically, he found that his storage shed had been broken into, and that a heavy barrel filled with dried fish had been hauled outside and torn open, apparently without the use of tools. George knew from the pair of 17-inch long human-like footprints which encircled his cabin that the intruder had been a Sasquatch, one of the legendary wildmen of the woods of which his people had long spoken. The tracks indicated that the giant had loitered about the home for some time before finally heading back into the mountains, tripping over a barbed wire fence as it departed the Chapman's property. To his relief, George quickly spied 4 smaller sets of human footprints leading along the Fraser River in the direction of Ruby Creek. He followed the tracks to his father's house, where he discovered his family had taken refuge. Accompanied by George's father, who armed himself with a hunting rifle, the Chapmans returned to their cabin the following day. In the night succeeding the incident, they heard strange howls emanating from the nearby woods. Sometimes they would awake in the morning to find huge footprints in the vicinity of the cabin. When the terrifying nocturnal visitations persisted for a week straight, the Chapmans decided to abandon their cabin and relocate. In 1957, the Ruby Creek incident attracted the attention of John Willison Green, a Canadian journalist and one of Canada's most prominent Sasquatch researchers. Green was so impressed by the Chapmans' testimonies that he decided to settle in Harrison Hot Springs, where he lived and carried out his research until his death in 2016. The incident at Ruby Creek, of course, was not the only Sasquatch sighting to take place around Harrison Hot Springs, not by a long shot. Back in March 1932, for example, several newspapers around Canada and the United States reported on an alleged sighting experienced by Frank Dean, a resident of Harrison Mills, located across the Harrison River from the Chehalis Reserve. One night, the story goes, Dean was roused by the barking of his dog. He stepped outside to investigate the commotion and saw an enormous hairy man standing in the moonlight. The creature growled at Dean and began to advance towards him. Terrified, Dean stumbled back into his cabin and barred the door. The giant prowled about his cabin for some time before finally retreating into the bush. In the summer of 1934, the experience of a Miss James Caulfield, who lived with her husband on a farm outside of Harrison Hot Springs, hit papers across the continent. While washing her clothes in the Harrison River, Miss Caulfield heard a noise similar to that of a hummingbird. In her own words, "I turned my head, but instead of a bird, there stood the most terrible thing I ever saw in my life. I thought I'd die, for the thing that made the funny noise was a big man covered with hair from head to foot. He was looking at me, and I couldn't help looking at him. I guessed he was a Sasquatch, so I covered my eyes with my hand, for the Indians say that if a Sasquatch catches your eye, you are in his power. They hypnotize you. I felt faint, and as I backed away to get to the house, I tripped and fell. As he came near, I screamed and fainted." Fortunately, her scream attracted the attention of Mr. Caulfield, who ran to her assistance just in time to catch a glimpse of a huge, hairy figure darting into the woods. The Ruby Creek incident, Frank Dean's sighting, and Miss Caulfield's experience are but a few of the many Sasquatch stories to come out of Harrison Hot Springs. From peeking through windows at hapless farmwives to hurling rocks at Chehalis fishermen, the Sasquatch are said to have made fairly regular appearances in the Harrison area throughout the 1930s and 40s. Some say that the legendary wildman of the woods pays the occasional visit to his old stomping grounds to this very day. If, like J.W. Burns and John Green, you find yourself enthralled by the mystery of the Sasquatch, consider paying a visit to Canada's Sasquatch capital. There you can hike the trails of Sasquatch Provincial Park, a natural area located about 4 miles west of Ruby Creek, or brush up on your Sasquatch lore at the local Sasquatch Museum. A relaxing soak in Harrison's thermal waters makes for an excellent wind down after a long day of Sasquatch hunting. And Sasquatch Days, with its canoe races and traditional salmon barbecue, offers a tantalizing glimpse into the culture of the Chehalis people, from whom the legend of the Sasquatch derives. If you do decide to pay a visit to Harrison Hot Springs, remember to keep your eyes peeled. If you're really lucky, you might just catch a glimpse of the most famous forest-dwelling denizen of the Sasquatch capital of Canada.